ولا تعجل بالقرآن من قبل أن يقضى إليك وحيه وقل رب زدني علما.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا، من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد. So carrying on then with Al-Aqidah Al-Wasitiyyah. Last time we spoke about the 6 pillars of Iman. And the final 2, the Iman in the Day of Judgment and the Iman in the decree. Those 2 we mentioned, we'll come back to them in detail later on. Because later in the book, the descriptions of the Day of Judgment are going to be mentioned, and also the decree is going to be spoken about. So those 2 sections we will come back to in more detail later on in the book, insha'Allah ta'ala. So then after that, the author says, وَمِنَ الْإِيمَانِ بِاللَّهِ الْإِيمَانُ بِمَا وَصَفَ بِهِ نَفْسَهُ وَوَصَفَهُ بِهِ رَسُولُهُ مُحَمَّدٌ sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that from the Iman in Allah is to have Iman in what Allah has described Himself with, has attributed to Himself, and what the Messenger, His Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, has described Allah with, has attributed to Allah. So that there is talking about the head of all of the pillars of Iman. Back to the beginning, the Iman in Allah. That one of the aspects of our Iman in Allah is to have Iman in what Allah attributed to Himself, what Allah described Himself with, and what His Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam described Him with. Meaning, if somebody was to reject that, they reject what Allah has described Himself with, or what the Messenger has described Allah with. They reject the names and the attributes basically. Then that would be from the fold of kufr, from the actions of kufr, that a person rejects what Allah has described Himself with, rejects what Allah has attributed to Himself. Then that person would not be a mu'min. And this is highlighted in the Quran, where it speaks about the mushrikun, and it speaks about those who make the ilhad, and they do the rejection of the names and attributes of Allah. The details are going to come section by section as we go through the book. Because it doesn't mean that anybody who has some type of misinterpretation about the names and attributes of Allah has therefore committed kufr and is a kafir. Not like that. The details are going to come. There are certain groups from the groups of deviation who deviated in the names and attributes of Allah, who were declared as disbelievers, but not necessarily anybody. So the details of all of that are going to build slowly as we go through the book. Right now, just generally saying here that we believe and have Iman in what Allah described Himself with, And the one who doesn't have iman in that, then he is not a mu'min. وكذلك من عطلها أو شبهها بصفات خلقه. And likewise a person who distorts them or makes resemblance of the attributes of Allah to creation, then those would all be errors and mistakes. And those are all the details we are going to come to insha'Allah ta'ala. Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala mentioned in An-Nuniyah, من شبه الله العظيم بخلقه فهو النصيب لمشرك نصراني أو عطل الرحمن من أوصافه فهو الكفور وليس ذا إيمان. Ibn al-Qayyim said in An-Nuniyah, the one who compares Allah the Almighty to His creation, then he is comparable unto the likes of the mushrik and the Christian. Or the one who rejects Ar-Rahman or His attributes, then he is a disbeliever and does not have iman. That is what is mentioned by Ibn al-Qayyim in a section of the famous Nuniyah. So what does this mean then? بما وصف به نفسه ووصفه به رسوله, that we have iman in what Allah described or attributed to Himself and what His Messenger attributed to Him. It is إثبات أن صفاته سبحانه وتعالى إنما تتلقى من السمع لا بآراء الخلق. The first thing this highlights to you, the principles are being established here one by one as we go through. The first thing that this is establishing to you is that the names and attributes of Allah, they are learnt via the revelation, not by the opinions of men or the thoughts of men. Because look what Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala says, we in our iman affirm what Allah described or attributed to Himself or what the Messenger attributed to Him. Meaning, we affirm the names and attributes that are in the Quran and the Sunnah. That is the source of our knowledge when it comes to discovering and learning what Allah has attributed to Himself and what the Messenger has attributed to Allah. It is not from what we think and make up and deduce and work out. The names and attributes of Allah are taken directly from the sources of the Quran and the Sunnah, the revelation. Our iman is to affirm what is in there, what Allah has described Himself with in the Quran, what the Messenger has described or attributed to Allah in the Sunnah. That's what we have iman in. Not what people make up and their explanations, and this means this and that means that. Not that. Names and attributes of Allah from the sources of revelation, which indicates that this is an affair which is tawqifi. This is an affair which is tawqifi. And what they mean by that is exactly what we've said, that you can only learn about these matters directly from the Quran and the Sunnah, the revelation. It cannot be something you work out or deduce or mathematically work things out. It doesn't work in that way. Tawqifi, it can only be taken from what we learn in the revelation. فَلَا يُوصَفُ, and this therefore means Allah is not to be described or attributed with anything which He did not attribute to Himself or the Messenger did not attribute to Him. That's the meaning of this section. Our iman in Allah is that we have iman in what Allah described Himself or attributed to Himself and what the Messenger attributed to Him. Meaning therefore that this knowledge is tawqifi. It comes only from the sources of revelation, not from your thoughts and what you work out and what you deduce. And on top of that, it therefore means you cannot describe or attribute to Allah anything which is not found in the Quran and the Sunnah. You cannot attribute to Allah anything which Allah has not attributed to Himself in the Quran. And you cannot attribute anything to Allah that the Messenger has not attributed to Allah. So that section is making very clear that the source of our knowledge, this whole book we are going to be studying, all of the names and attributes in here, everything is tawqifi. It will be directly from the evidences. What is in the speech of Allah in the Quran and what is in the statements of the Messenger in the Sunnah. It is not going to be my thoughts or Ibn Taymiyyah's thoughts or anybody else's thoughts. It is going to be purely and directly from the revelation only. Al-Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala mentioned, لا يوصف الله إلا بما وصف به نفسه أو وصف به رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يتجاوز القرآن والحديث. Al-Imam Ahmad said, Allah is not attributed with anything except that which He attributed to Himself or His Messenger attributed to Him, and you cannot go beyond what is in the Quran and the Hadith. لا يتجاوز القرآن والحديث. You cannot go beyond what is in the Quran and the Hadith. That's it. You cannot make up names and say that sounds like a suitable name for Allah. You cannot make up attributes and say that appears to be suitable for Allah. Al-Imam Ahmad says you do not go beyond the Quran and the Hadith. Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala mentioned in Al-Bada'i' ما يطلق عليه في باب الأسماء والصفات توقيفي. That which can be mentioned in terms of the names and the attributes, in that discussion of the names and the attributes, it is tawqifi. Ibn al-Qayyim mentions tawqifi, only what you find directly there in the Quran and the Sunnah. وما يطلق عليه في باب الأخبار لا يجب أن يكون توقيفيا كالشيء والموجود والقديم ونحو ذلك. And what is mentioned about Allah in terms of something informative, that Allah does something or some information about Allah generally, not specifying it as an attribute of Allah, not specifying it as a name of Allah, but more general information about Allah, then that is not necessarily tawqifi. A person may mention general details about Allah from everything we know, general, not specific names or attributes, and that generality is something separate. We'll get into more detail and break that down in the sections later, the Babul Akhbar as they call it, because the Babul Akhbar, what you can say about Allah generally, is a lot more open than what you can say about Allah specifically in His names and attributes. The names and attributes are very specific in the revelation only. What you can say otherwise generally about Allah from the evidences, that's a little bit more open. But we'll get to those details when we start breaking down how to understand and believe in the names and attributes throughout the book, insha'Allah. There are a few other principles that we should also add on to our understanding at this stage. The first principle, the key principle we have just established is that this whole discussion on the names and attributes, it is all tawqifi. All of it from the revelation only, not interpretations and thoughts and ideas of man. That's the first principle. Secondly, now we should also understand Inna asma Allahi wa sifatihi ghayru mahsuratin bi'adadin ma'ruf. These are some general principles about the names and attributes to build up a foundation to go into Wasitiyyah. The second principle now is that the names and attributes of Allah are not restricted to any particular number. The names and attributes of Allah are not restricted to any particular number. Many people mistakenly believe that Allah has only 99 names, for example. And we know that is a mistake. Allah has more than that. They are not restricted to 99. So that is the second thing to understand. The names and attributes of Allah are not restricted to a particular number. They are not restricted to 99 as many people mistakenly believe. The names and attributes are open beyond that, and we do not know the exact number. Thirdly, the attributes of Allah, these are general principles. We're going to get into the details and the examples in the book. The third general principle, that the attributes of Allah are in one respect two types. You can always look at them in different perspectives and give different categories, but from one general perspective, one basic perspective, you can say that the attributes of Allah are two types. There are sifat dhatiyah, the attributes of Allah which are from the essence of Allah. Sifat dhatiyah, attributes that are from the essence, are never separated from Allah. There is never a time when Allah is not attributed with these attributes. They are absolutely from the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sifat dhatiyah. The second type are the sifat fi'liyah, the attributes of Allah linked to the mashi'ah of Allah, linked to the will of Allah. And they are the attributes of Allah, for example, al-istiwa, the descending in the last third of the night and in other parts where it's mentioned, that is linked to the will of Allah. Allah descends in the last third of the night. For example, al-maji, that Allah comes on the day of judgment, for example, that Allah comes to do the accountability. That occurs at that time, Allah wills, and so it is linked to the mashi'ah of Allah. Before I mentioned al-istiwa is rising above the throne, and nuzul is the descent that we spoke about before, and nuzul, that Allah descends in the last third of the night. Al-istiwa, of course, is that Allah rises above the throne, and we're going to get to all of those details insha'Allah ta'ala. All of the discussion about the throne of Allah, Allah rising above the throne, we'll get to all of those in the relevant chapters insha'Allah. So basically, there are the sifat dhatiyah, the attributes that are from the essence of Allah. And there are the sifat fi'liyah, the attributes that Allah does upon and when He wills to do them. Fourthly, when we talk about Islam, there are 5 pillars of Islam. When we talk about Iman, there are 6 pillars of Iman. When we talk about the decree, there are the 4 pillars of the decree. When we talk about the names and attributes, there are pillars to the Iman in the names and attributes of Allah. There are certain pillars to the Iman in the names and attributes of Allah. What are these pillars, the arkan of the Iman in the names and attributes of Allah? Firstly, Al-Imanu bis-Sifah. The first pillar obviously is that you have Iman in the actual attribute. The first pillar is the Iman in the actual attribute. You believe, have Iman, yaqeen in that attribute of Allah. That's Sifah. Secondly, the second pillar is ma dallat alayhi. What that attribute indicates. Because every attribute of Allah has a meaning behind it. Every sifah has some type of meaning behind it. So you must believe in that meaning. So for example, Allah has the attribute of Ar-Rahmah, mercy. You believe in that. What does that indicate in terms of the meaning? That Allah shows mercy to His creation. Allah has the attribute of mercy, and so He shows mercy to His creation. Even to the disbelievers, to the animals, mercy is shown. So you believe in that meaning. Not like some of the people of innovation, they believe in the names, but they don't believe in the meaning behind it. So Ahlul Sunnah, we believe in the name, the attribute, and what it means, the meaning of that attribute. And thirdly, the impact of that attribute. The impact of that attribute, the effects of that attribute. So what are the effects of Allah being Ar-Rahim, Ar-Rahman? That He shows the mercy to His creation, and His creation then experience that mercy from Allah. That we breathe and we eat and we drink and we have the clothes and the roofs and the homes. We experience the mercy of Allah. That is the effect upon us that we are experiencing. So in simple terms, sometimes they mention that it is to believe in the name of Allah, to believe in the attribute that comes from that name, and to believe in the effects of all of that. That is how often it will be mentioned. We just mentioned it now, to believe in the attribute, to believe in the meaning of that attribute, and to believe in the effects of that attribute. That's okay. But sometimes they mention it as to believe in the name, and every name has a attribute. So to believe in the name, to believe in the attribute, and thirdly to believe in the impact and effects of that attribute. One example is that Allah is Al-Alim. Allah is the all-knowledgeable. What is the attribute that we understand from that? Knowledge. That Allah has knowledge. Knowledge that encompasses everything. Knowledge which encompasses every affair, and nothing is hidden from Allah. You would not say that Allah is Al-Alim bila ilm. That Allah is Al-Alim, but He doesn't have knowledge encompassing the affairs. Ahlul Sunnah, we believe in the attributes, we believe in the names, we believe in the effects of those names and attributes. Those are the three main aspects. Belief in the names, belief in the attribute that comes from that name, belief in the effects that arise from that thereafter. Three parts. The next principle, the fifth principle, ليس في أسماء الله وصفاته نفي محض بل كل نفي وجد في أسماء الله وصفاته فهو لإثبات كمال ضده إذ النفي المحض عدم والعدم ليس بشيء فضلا عن أن يمدح به كما قال تعالى ولا يظلم ربك أحدا أي لكمال عدله ولا يؤوده حفظهما أي لكمال قوته واقتداره. The fifth principle to remember is when we talk about negations in the chapter of names and attributes, that Allah does not do this and Allah does not do that. When we talk about negations regarding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it must be remembered they are not negations for the purpose of absolute negations. It is not a negation just for the sake of the negation. If you simply negate something, there is no praiseworthiness in that necessarily. There is no praiseworthiness in that necessarily. You say somebody, such and such a person, he's not stupid. You've negated from him stupidity. But have you affirmed that he's actually a very smart and intelligent man on the other hand? Not really. He may just be average. He's just not stupid, but has he got anything more on the other side? Smart, intelligent, IQ of 500? Not necessarily. So a negation by itself isn't praiseworthiness. So when we talk about the negations regarding Allah, Allah doesn't do this or doesn't do that, it's not just for the sake of the negation. The negation by itself isn't praiseworthy. But it's about emphasizing and highlighting the opposite of that negation from perfection. It is about emphasizing the opposite of that negation, and the opposite of the negation is going to be something, of course, praiseworthy. An example of that is when Allah says in the Quran, وَلَا يَظْلِمُ رَبُّكَ أَحَدًا, and your Lord does not oppress anyone. So we have negated oppression from Allah. We have negated that Allah does wrongdoing to anyone. Allah does not wrong anyone. But what is the purpose of that? It's not just for the sake of saying Allah doesn't wrong anyone. It is for the sake of then highlighting the perfection, which is that Allah deals with the people upon absolute justice. By saying Allah does not wrong anyone, you learn from that the perfection of the opposite regarding Allah. Therefore, if Allah doesn't wrong anyone, He must deal with the people upon absolute perfection of justice. That's the point of negations when it comes to Allah. You negate something, of course, because that negation is something dispraiseworthy, you negate that, but then it's not just for that and stop there. It is to then continue on and understand the perfection of the opposite. It's like, for example, also لا يؤوده حفظهما. In Ayatul Kursi, which we're going to get to, a full detailed explanation of Ayatul Kursi comes up in the book. لا يؤوده حفظهما, that it does not burden or create any issue for Allah to preserve them and guard them. Why? Why are we negating this from Allah? It doesn't cause Allah any problem. Because we are emphasizing the opposite, the perfection of the strength and ability of Allah. That nothing overwhelms Allah. Nothing overwhelms Allah. Allah is not overwhelmed in preserving them and maintaining them because of the perfection of His strength and ability. So every time there is a negation being spoken about regarding the names and attributes of Allah, it is not just for the sake of the negation and stop. It is the negation, but then on top of that, to understand the emphasis of the perfection on the other side. So there is no such thing as absolute negation and full stop. When it comes to the names and attributes of Allah, there's no such thing as negation for the sake of negation and full stop. It is negation and then more on top. Negation and then understanding the opposite. So that's what they say. There is no nafi mahad, meaning there is no negation just for the sake of the negation and full stop. There is always the understanding of the opposite. The sixth principle to understand, that the methodology of Ahlus Sunnah, this is connected to the previous one, the methodology of Ahlus Sunnah is to generalize when it comes to the negations, to generalize when it comes to the negations, and to be very specific and detailed when it comes to the affirmations. When we are negating things, it is generalized. When we are affirming, then it's detailed and precise regarding the names and attributes of Allah. An example of that is لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. There is nothing like unto him, but he is the all-hearing and the all-seeing. This is the most famous ayah when it comes to the names and attributes of Allah. This is the foundation of the names and attributes of Allah. And this will come up throughout the book. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There is nothing like unto Allah. وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. But He is the all-hearing and the all-seeing. The first part is a negation. The second part is affirming the hearing and the seeing. In the negation part, there is nothing like Allah. Have any examples been given? Nothing. Generalized. There is nothing like Allah. Generalized negation of any type of resemblance to Allah. But in the affirmation part, is it general, but Allah has attributes? Or is it, but Allah has hearing and seeing, specific attributes? The affirmation part is mentioning specifics, whereas the negation part is leaving it general. There is nothing like Allah, and Allah is the all-hearing and the all-seeing. They are specific attributes of Allah. It doesn't just say Allah, there is nothing like Allah, and Allah has attributes. Doesn't say that, that would be general. Rather specific in the affirmation, hearing, seeing. So the methodology of Ahlus Sunnah is that we generalize when it comes to the negations, but we specify when it comes to the affirmations. Why is that? Or what is one of the reasons behind that? Anyone? Logically speaking, without having to understand the details here, logically speaking, why do you generalize in negation and specify in the affirmation?
Because if you give the example of the ayah, when you're generalizing negation, there's nothing at all, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and specifying
Logically, why would you generalize in negations and be more specific in affirmations? They give an example sometimes. I don't remember where I read it, maybe in the Shaykh Uthaymeen explanation. They give an example. Imagine I was to say to somebody that you, mashallah, you are not a donkey. You, mashallah, are not stupid. You, mashallah, are not a fool. You, mashallah, are not an idiot. You, mashallah, are not thick. You, mashallah, not any of those things. The person is probably going to hit you because you are now giving negations on him, sounding like you're actually mocking him. You're not a donkey, mashallah. You're not a fool. You're not an idiot. You're not this, you're not that. You start doing it like that and it looks like you're mocking the person. You don't specify negations in that way. If you start specifying you are not a thief. You are not the one who went and robbed such and such. You would not take from an old lady. You would not do this. You would not do that. You don't sit there for an hour saying you wouldn't do this and you wouldn't do that. The person is thinking, okay, calm down. I know I wouldn't do any of those things. You don't need to go into detail and sit there for an hour. I wouldn't do this and I wouldn't do that. So you don't do specified and detailed negations like that, logically. And it's a similar type of thing here. You don't go into specific and details of the negation. Allah doesn't do this and doesn't do that and doesn't do this. You don't do it. It is generalized. There is nothing like unto Allah. Allah does not oppress anyone. Not details. Allah doesn't do this to somebody, doesn't do that to somebody, and mention all of these sins and wrong things that we do. Generalized. Allah does not wrong anyone. There is nothing like Allah. Generalized in the negations, but specific in the praiseworthy attributes and affirmations of them. That is the principal way of Ahlul Sunnah. These are very important principles as an introduction, because when we get through the later parts of the book, you will see how the people of innovation went astray, and they went astray because they failed on one or two or three or more of these principles. So some of them started going into detail in negation, some of them started doing this, doing that. They neglected these principles, and as a consequence, they began going astray. So that is the sixth principle. The sixth. So now the seventh. This one, we'll mention it, you can just make a note of it, but it probably won't be clear. This is one of the principles which requires a bit more detail, and you would find it in books like Al-Qawa'id Al-Muthla of Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen. But it is the principle that the names of Allah and His attributes, when you think about the names and attributes of Allah in terms of the essence of Allah, then every name and attribute indicates what? Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Al-Ghafur, Al-Alim. All of the names of Allah, all the attributes of Allah, when you think about them in terms of the essence of Allah, they are all names and attributes to the perfection of Allah. They are all pointing to one and the same thing. In terms of the essence of Allah, when you're thinking about the names and attributes in terms of the essence of Allah, then Al-Alim is Al-Ghafur, Ar-Rahman is Ar-Rahim. They are all names of Allah. They are all synonymous in that way. All of the names and attributes of Allah are one and the same thing in terms of all of them returning back to Allah. So when thinking about any name or attribute in the context of Allah, then all of them are the same. They all indicate Allah. But when thinking about the names and attributes of Allah, in terms of each one as a separate topic, Ar-Rahman, Rahmah, Al-Ghafur, Maghfirah, Al-Alim, Ilm. When you look at each one individually, then each one is something separate and different. So the names and attributes of Allah are all the same in terms of the context of looking at them to Allah. They all indicate Allah. But when looking at them for each one, looking at each one, then they each have different meanings. So the scholars, they mention this, that in the perspective of the essence of Allah, all the names and attributes are the same. They indicate Allah. But when looking at them individually as names and attributes one by one, then each one has its own meanings. The next principle: the names and attributes of Allah are names and attributes in reality. This is not metaphors or similes or examples. When we're talking about the names and attributes of Allah, then they are Asma'ullahi subhanahu wa sifatuhu haqiqah. They are actual and real. And this is one of the biggest things that you'll see the people of innovation went astray in, when they began saying, no, this name or this attribute of Allah isn't actually that. It's this or it's that, and they give different meanings. And they give different interpretations. It's not actually what it says it is. It actually means something else. And so they go off into all types of interpretations. The foundational rule is the names and attributes of Allah are names and attributes in reality. That's the foundational rule there. But the people of innovation, that is one of their biggest deviations. We'll see that inshaAllah throughout the book, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, and others like them. The next principle: if an attribute has a meaning which could have an element that is dispraiseworthy in terms of the word, an attribute which could have a meaning that is dispraiseworthy and a meaning that is praiseworthy. Certain words that we use, they can have different connotations, different meanings. Context, it could mean something bad. In a context, it could mean something good. If one of those words is being used, it is one of the attributes of Allah, or it is being used regarding Allah, then of course that word is not attributed to Allah in its completion. Because the aspect of it that is dispraiseworthy clearly is not attributed to Allah. Only the praiseworthy nature of it is attributed to Allah. They give examples of some of the things that you may say, that Allah is Al-Murid. Allah is Al-Murid. They may say that Allah does what He wills, irada. He is the Murid, He does what He wills from irada. But a person who wills to do something, linguistically now, somebody who wills to do something, somebody could will to do something bad, and they could will to do something good. So in these types of terminology, you must understand, when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is none of the dispraiseworthy aspect attributed to Allah whatsoever. Even when we come to some of the names or some of the aspects, like Allah takes revenge. So now you may say, okay, well that sounds quite a lot like dispraiseworthy. But those kinds of titles or names or those topics, when we get to them, about Allah taking revenge or other things of that nature, they are always only in the context of praiseworthiness. That somebody has wronged and then Allah takes revenge on them, i.e. then Allah punishes them accordingly and justly. So the meaning of Allah taking revenge on them is not like how we understand in our behavior, that you go angry against someone to take revenge and beat them up and do this. Not like that. The actions of Allah are all upon wisdom and greatness. So with these types of things, it's very careful. You have to be very careful to understand no ill is attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The next principle number 10. Sometimes you could mention about Allah a certain term, a certain phrase, but that does not necessitate that there is a name to be derived from it. This is like the akhbar we were talking about. We can say Allah does this and Allah does that from what's in the Quran. That doesn't mean you can derive a name for that action. So for example, some of the examples, وَمَكَرُوا وَمَكَرَ اللَّهُ, that they planned and plotted, and Allah planned and plotted. But can we say therefore makara, makrun, can we say that one of the names of Allah is al-makir? That's the ismul fa'il which comes from makara yamkuru. You cannot. Even though some of these things may be mentioned, and like we said, it's in the context of praiseworthiness that this occurs to the disbelievers and those who wronged. But can we derive names from these things? No. So don't think that everything which is mentioned about Allah in terms of generalities, that every one of those things can then have a name to it. Not necessarily. The names are going to be the ones that are affirmed specifically in the revelation. Anything otherwise, generally, from the information regarding Allah, doesn't necessitate there'll be a name you can take from that. And remember, these are all principles. We're generally just listing them now. They will all become clear as you go through the examples of the book one by one later. Another principle to remember is that there are certain terms, certain names that are given to Allah and creation. And they are both valid in Allah and the creation. But of course, like we've already said, there is no resemblance. So for example, al-ilm. Do we have knowledge or not? We have knowledge. In the Quran and the Sunnah, we've been told to gain knowledge. The Quran affirms we have knowledge. وَمَا أُوتِيتُ مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. You've not been given from knowledge except a small amount, but that means you have been given knowledge. So we have knowledge, al-ilm. Allah has al-ilm or not? Absolutely, al-alim. So the same term is being used. Allah has ilm, we have ilm. And that is valid. But of course, there is no resemblance whatsoever to the knowledge of Allah and our knowledge. But the term can be used. Another example, hearing and seeing. وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. Do we have hearing and seeing? We have hearing, we have seeing. And we can affirm that to Allah. But there is no resemblance between the hearing and seeing of Allah to our hearing and seeing. A person may say, what do you mean? How can that work? We'll get to the detailed examples later, but a general example now, we'll mention it later again. Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen mentioned the example about the word leg. If somebody says to you, describe a leg, how would you describe a leg? You could describe a leg, it's 4 foot long, has meat on it, has a knee on it, has an ankle, all these things. The leg of a human. What if somebody comes along and says, no, a leg is only 1 centimeter long and it's really thin. That's what a leg is. Absolutely, he's right as well. Another person comes along, no, a leg is the size of a lamppost. That's how big a leg is. Absolutely. Another one, a leg is the size of a tree trunk. That's how thick it is. Absolutely, he's right too. Because all of those are legs of different things. The leg of a human, the leg of a spider, the leg of a giraffe, the leg of an elephant. They're all legs, but they all have completely different descriptions. They're all different, but they're all called leg. That leg of a spider and the leg of a giraffe, look at the difference. Yet that's a leg and this is a leg. The leg of an elephant and the leg of a child, of a human, both legs. They are both still legs. One the size of a tree trunk, one the size of a bottle of baby, but they are legs. So you can have the same word, but that doesn't necessitate that they are the same thing. Doesn't necessitate that there's a resemblance between them. Meaning same thing, i.e. resemblance. There's no resemblance between them. The basic meaning is understood. The basic meaning is understood. So if Allah says He has a hand, we know what a hand is. That basic meaning is understood. But the detail of it, that we cannot understand, we cannot compare, we cannot resemble our hands of creation to the hand of Allah. So sometimes the same terms may be used for Allah and in humans, but there is no resemblance between them whatsoever. The final couple of things we'll mention as the introduction here. And these are important principles. They mention them in all of the books of Aqidah. One is the principle, you hear about it in all of the books of Aqidah. Al-qawlu fi sifat kal-qawli fi dhat. And I remember that one very clearly. It was on the exam paper for the masters in Aqidah in the university. Al-qawlu fi sifat kal-qawli fi dhat. What you say about the attributes of Allah is exactly what you say about the essence of Allah. What you say about the attributes of Allah is exactly what you say about the essence of Allah. فَكَمَا أَنَّنَا نُثْبِتُ لِلَّهِ ذَاتًا لَا تُشْبِهُ الذَّوَاتِ. So just like we affirm Allah has an essence, Allah is in a way that is essence of Allah, is not comparable to anything in creation, then likewise the attributes of Allah are not comparable to anything in creation. Everybody knows Allah is not like us. We are not comparable to Allah. We do not resemble Allah. Then likewise the attributes of Allah do not resemble our attributes. The statement regarding the essence of Allah is the same as what you say regarding the attributes of Allah. And that's important because many of the people of innovation may say to you, the essence of Allah is not comparable, but all of a sudden the attributes are for them. The principle is very clear. The essence of Allah and the attributes of Allah, it's the same. There is no resemblance in the essence of Allah to us, and there is no resemblance to the attributes of Allah and us. Secondly, which is like a subsidiary of that principle, what you say about some of the attributes is exactly what you say in all of the rest of the attributes. Meaning you don't pick and mix, okay, this attribute, we're going to apply these rulings to it, and you can believe this about it and that about it, but that attribute, you can't believe this about it and that about it. What you say about these attributes, you say about the rest of the attributes. They're all the attributes of Allah. القول في بعض الصفات كالقول في البعض الآخر إذ لا فرق. And this again becomes very important because the people of innovation, they'll say to you certain names of Allah, you can believe in the attributes regarding them. But other names of Allah, we don't believe in the attributes. Can't be. What you say about some of the attributes, that applies to all of the attributes. You cannot come along and start distinguishing without any basis for distinguishing. Nothing in the Quran and the Sunnah has given you any evidence to distinguish between the names and attributes in that way. And that is where we're going to conclude today. Next week we're going to begin on the section, the very important section about tahrif, ta'til, takyif and tamthil. Those are going to become the four most important things in this whole book. So we'll begin from that section next week, insha'Allah ta'ala. Any questions up to there? Oh. Jumping ahead to next week. إِنَّكُمْ قَوْمٌ تَسْتَعْجِلُونَ. You are a group of people who are hasty. So there is a difference. There is a difference. And we're not going to tell you what the difference is today. You can do a homework. Preparation for next week. That question of yours, what is the difference between tashbih and tamtheel? Bring us your answers next week. We're going to do it next week, exactly that topic. And there is a difference. And you'll see from the Quran there's a difference. But everybody can do the homework for this week. See what answers you can find. What is the difference between tashbih and tamtheel? And why do we use one and not the other in our terminology? Anybody else? All right, we'll conclude upon that.
How do the scholars derive when they go through the Quran and Sunnah where it's actually the name of Allah and not like you said?
No, these are too advanced. All of these kinds of questions, you're going to get the answers for all of them as we go through the book. How do the scholars derive the names? How do they work out what is an attribute? We're going to learn all that in the book. There's no point answering all those questions now. That is the whole point of this book. So all of those things, you're going to learn them in the book. If at the end of the book you don't know the answer to that, then we can definitely discuss more. But right now, all of those things, they're going to come up stage by stage, week by week. You can see very clearly, small sections make it very apparent every week, very clear every week. You'll build it up and soon all of these things will become clear, inshaAllah. All right, we'll conclude upon that then. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.